The galaxy had known war for 3 centuries. Not the small kind of war, not border skirmishes or trade disputes settled with a few burned ships. The real kind. The kind that swallowed planets whole and left star systems quiet in the wrong way. The way a room goes quiet after something terrible has already happened inside it. 300 years of that. And in all that time, across every species that had ever pointed a weapon at another, one truth had stayed constant. The Vakari always won. The Vakari were not the largest species in the known galaxy. They were not the oldest, or the most technologically advanced, or the most numerous. But they were built for war, the way some creatures are built for deep water, completely, down to the bone. 7 feet tall, covered in scales the color of a moonless night, with bioluminescent crests that ran from the crown of the skull down the spine and lit up in battle like warning signals on a storm. They had fought 17 wars against humanity and won all 17, and they kept the records of every victory carved in stone in the Great Hall on Vakar Prime, because they were the kind of people who liked to remember. The border station of Halveth was not an impressive place. It sat at the edge of Vakari space like something that had been put there temporarily and then forgotten about. A collection of pressurized corridors, docking bays, and administrative offices built into the side of a dead asteroid. 3 smaller civilizations used the surrounding space as a trading corridor, which meant disputes came through Halveth the way water comes through a crack, constantly, and always at the wrong time. It was considered a minor posting. Safe, manageable, the kind of place you sent people when you wanted them visible but not important. The High Council had chosen it for Valeth and Luke because it was, in their estimation, exactly the right distance from anything that actually mattered. They arrived 6 months after the wedding and were given a shared administrative office, 2 small sleeping quarters, and a junior staff of 9. 5 Vakari and 4 human, which was itself a small political statement that nobody commented on openly. Valeth took charge of the administrative work within the first hour. This surprised no one. She reviewed the backlog of unresolved trade disputes, reorganized the filing system, scheduled 3 meetings that should have happened 2 weeks ago, and had a polite but firm conversation with the outgoing administrator that left him looking slightly pale. By the end of the first day, she had a clear picture of every problem Halveth had accumulated over the past 6 months, and a working plan to address most of them. Luke unpacked his bag, went for a run around the station perimeter, and came back to read. This became the pattern. Valeth ran the station with the kind of focused energy that made her staff slightly nervous in a productive way. The way people work harder not because they are afraid, but because they do not want to be the weak point in something that is clearly functioning well. She was good at this work, genuinely good. She could sit across from 2 faction representatives who had been trying to take pieces of each other for decades and find, inside the tangle of their grievances, the single thread that both of them could agree to hold. Luke attended meetings, reviewed logistics, read, ran, cooked his own meals in the small station kitchen at odd hours, which the staff found puzzling and a little fascinating, because cooking was not something people of status did in Vakari culture, and Luke did it without any apparent awareness that it was unusual. He made a dish with rice and eggs that smelled interesting enough that one of the junior Vakari staffers, a young soldier named Soth, eventually asked what it was. "Just something my grandmother made," Luke said, and offered Soth a portion. Soth tried it, thought about it seriously, said it was acceptable. Luke looked quietly pleased, which was the most visibly pleased Valeth had seen him since they arrived. She watched him. In those early months, the way she watched everything, carefully, without making it obvious. And the thing she kept returning to, the thing she could not fit neatly into any category, was how still he was. Not lazy, not absent. He was present in every room he entered, more present somehow than people who talked more, or moved more, or took up more visible space. But he held it all inward, and he watched, and he said less than he knew. She noticed the exits. She noticed him notice the exits. Every room they walked into, within the first 30 seconds, his eyes moved. door, windows, the people between him and both. He did it the way other people breathe, automatic, unthinking. She asked him about it one evening after a particularly long trade negotiation that had ended well. They were walking back through the lower corridor, and she had watched him spend 4 hours in that meeting room without once sitting with his back to the entrance. "You always find the exits first," she said. "Yes," he said, "before you look at anything else." "Yes." Why? He thought about it. Not in the way people think when they are deciding whether to tell you something, in the way they think when they are finding the right words for something they have never explained out loud. "A long time ago," he said, "I was in a room where I didn't know where the exit was. That was a bad day. I decided not to have that day again." Valeth considered this. "How bad?" "Bad enough," he said, and that was all. She did not push. She had learned in those months that pushing Luke produced nothing useful. He was not hiding things out of distrust or strategy. He simply did not speak about himself the way most people did. He answered what was asked, directly, and offered nothing extra. It was not coldness. It was more like the way a very deep well does not make noise, not because there is nothing in it, but because the surface is a long way up. The incident with the Thurvac courier happened on a Tuesday. Valeth had been in her office reviewing a shipping contract dispute when Soth came to the door looking slightly unsettled and told her there was a situation in Corridor 7. A Thurvac cargo courier named Breck, large even by Thurvac standards, 4-armed, with a history of aggressive debt collection, had cornered one of the human logistics staff over a payment disagreement. The human logistics staff member was a young woman named Dana, 22 years old, 3 months into her first posting, and she had apparently been on her way to get tea when Breck decided that the corridor was a good place to resolve a financial dispute. Valeth took 2 guards and moved quickly. They reached Corridor 7 to find the situation already finished. Breck was seated on the floor with all 4 arms secured behind him using a length of cargo strap, looking dazed in the specific way of someone whose understanding of how the last 2 minutes went was still catching up with them. Dana was standing against the wall, completely unhurt, still holding her cup of tea. She had not spilled it. Luke was leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. "What happened?" Valeth asked. "Misunderstanding," Luke said. "It's resolved." Dana, who appeared to be running on the particular energy of someone who had just been frightened and then unfrightened very fast, said, "He moved really quickly." "The courier moved first?" Valeth asked. "No," Dana said. "I mean, yes, the courier moved first, but I meant—" She paused, clearly trying to find language for what she had seen. "I mean, Captain Carver moved really quickly." Breck, who had 4 arms and a reputation and 300 pounds on Luke, looked at the floor and said in a very quiet voice that he would like to be escorted off the station at the earliest opportunity. Luke pushed off the wall and said he would arrange it, and walked away down the corridor like a man returning to something he had left on the stove. Valeth stood in the corridor for a moment after he left. She looked at the cargo strap. It was a standard docking line, thick and heavy. It had been wrapped around 4 Thurvac arms with the kind of efficient neatness that takes either a lot of practice or a very calm mind, possibly both. That evening she pulled his service record again. She had read it before the wedding, as part of her preparation. But she had read it the first time looking for titles, for medals, for the visible markers of importance. She read it now looking for something else. What she found was a list. 17 postings over 12 years. Conflict zones, border disputes, hostage situations, 3 separate incidents classified under a category that had no public description. Every single one had been resolved. The after-action reports were mostly redacted. The parts that were not redacted were short. They used words like contained and neutralized and de-escalated without ever explaining how. And every single report ended the same way. 1 line. The same line copied into each file as if someone had given up trying to describe what had happened and defaulted to the only thing they could confirm. Situation resolved. Captain Carver present. She read it 4 times. Then she closed the file, looked out the small window of her office at the dark and quiet stretch of space beyond the station, and sat with the particular feeling of a person who has been living next to something and has only just begun to understand what it is. Outside, the stars were very still. Somewhere in the lower level, faintly, she could smell rice and eggs. The Vorkai had been patient. That was the thing about them that made them dangerous. Not their numbers, not their weapons, not the anger they carried like a stone in the chest. It was the patience. They had spent over a year building quietly inside the Vakari military, finding officers who felt the same way they did, passing messages through channels that looked like normal logistics traffic, moving people and weapons slowly enough that no single movement looked like anything worth watching. Valeth had known about them. She had received 2 intelligence reports in the past 4 months that mentioned the Vorkai faction by name. She had flagged both reports. She had sent recommendations up to her father's council. She had believed, based on everything she knew about military insurrection and the particular kind of courage it required to move against a ruling family, that they were not yet ready to act. She had been wrong. It began at 0300 station time, when Halveth was in its quiet hours and most of the staff were sleeping. A Vorkai-aligned transport ship docked at Bay 4 using a false cargo registry, listed as a mineral shipment from the outer belt, cleared 3 days earlier by a customs officer who was later found to have been paid very well for his cooperation. The ship carried 46 soldiers packed into cargo containers with oxygen supplies and weapons wrapped in thermal shielding to avoid the standard scan. They moved through the station in 4 teams. Team 1 cut the external communications within the first 4 minutes. They knew exactly where the relay nodes were, which meant someone had given them the station layout in advance. Team 2 locked down the command center with a sonic device that knocked the night crew unconscious without killing them. Team 3 secured the docking bays, sealing every ship that wasn't theirs. Team 4 moved for the residential wing. Team 4's objective was simple: take the princess, kill the human, bring Valeth back to Vorkai leadership as leverage against her father. Without the treaty bond, without the princess, the peace arrangement would collapse, and the Vorkai could stand in front of the Dominion and say, "Look, the humans could not even protect what was given to them. The treaty was always weakness. Come back to war." It was a good plan. It had been built carefully over a long time by people who were serious about what they wanted. It had one problem. When Team 4 reached the residential corridor at 11 minutes past 0300, Luke was already there. He was standing in the middle of the hallway under the pale blue emergency lighting that had clicked on when the main power was rerouted. He was wearing a gray shirt and dark tactical pants and nothing else. No armor, no helmet, no jacket. He had a standard sidearm in the holster at his hip, and his arms were loose at his sides, and he looked, in the flat blue light, completely relaxed. Team 4 stopped. Their leader was a veteran soldier named Kavoth. He had been in the Vakari military for 22 years. He had fought in 2 border wars and 3 major engagements, and he had never once hesitated before a target. He looked at the human man standing alone in the corridor and felt, for a reason he could not immediately name, a small, cold thing move through him. He pushed it down. "Step aside," he said. "We have no quarrel with you, human. Our business is with the princess." "I know what your business is," Luke said. His voice was calm, not aggressive, not afraid. Just calm, the way a very flat road is calm, completely even in every direction as far as you can see. "You're not going to finish it." "There are 46 of us," Kavoth said. 42 now," Luke said. "Your Team 2 had some trouble at the command center." Kavoth stared at him. He had received no such report. Communications were cut. He had no way to verify or deny what the human was saying, and they both knew it. "Step aside," he said again. "No," Luke said. Kavoth sent 4 soldiers forward. Valeth was behind a door 11 meters down the corridor. She did not know, then or ever, exactly how Luke had known the attack was coming before the alarms went silent. She would ask him later, and he would say only that the docking bay scan had been slightly too clean, which she did not fully understand, but accepted. What she knew was that he had appeared at her door at 0258, 2 minutes before the station went dark, and told her in a quiet voice to get dressed and come with him. And something in the way he said it made her move without asking questions. He had put her behind the door, told her to stay, and walked back out into the corridor. Now she watched through the gap between door and frame. She watched the 4 soldiers move toward him, and then she watched something that her mind, for just a moment, struggled to process. Not because it was supernatural or impossible, but because it happened so fast and so efficiently that the normal way of watching one thing and then another thing did not quite apply. It was more like a single motion with 4 outcomes. The first soldier went down and Luke was already past him. The second reached out and found nothing to grab. The third took a step back and it did not help. The fourth fired once. She heard the sharp crack of it in the corridor, and somehow Luke was not where the shot went. 4 soldiers. The whole thing took less time than it takes to say it out loud. Kavoth fired a full burst. Luke turned his body, fast and precise, and most of the burst went past him. One shot caught his left arm. She saw him absorb it, saw the small shift in his expression that was the only sign he felt it at all. And then he closed the distance between himself and Kavoth in 2 steps and put him into the floor. The corridor shook. Luke stood up. He picked up Kavoth's weapon. He looked down the hallway at the remaining soldiers, 38 of them, coming from 4 different directions now, and his face was completely still. "Last chance," he said. "Leave." Nobody left. What followed lasted 22 minutes. Valeth stayed behind the door because Luke had told her to, and because she understood, in a deep and practical part of herself, that opening that door would give him one more thing to think about, and he did not need that right now. She listened. She had been through 3 wars. She had heard combat before, the noise of it, the chaos, the shouting and the scrambling and the desperate improvisation of people fighting for their lives. This did not sound like that. It was quiet, mostly. There were impacts, there were short bursts of weapons fire, never more than 2 or 3 shots, and then silence, and then movement, and then another impact somewhere further down the corridor. It moved through the station the way a single-minded thing moves, not frantically, not randomly, but with direction. Like a problem being solved one step at a time by someone who had already worked out the answer and was simply doing the work of getting there. And then it stopped. The door opened. Luke stood in the frame with a borrowed Vicari energy rifle over one shoulder and blood on both hands. None of it his own except for the graze on his left arm, which had burned through the sleeve of his shirt. The emergency lighting was still blue. The corridor behind him was very quiet. He looked at her. His breathing was slightly elevated. That was the only sign. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. Her voice came out steady, and she was glad of it. He nodded. He held out a comm unit. He had taken it from one of the soldiers, she realized. "Communications are back up," he said. "Your father should know what happened here." She took the comm unit. She looked past him into the corridor. She could see shapes in the dim light. Soldiers on the floor, alive. She could see movement, hear breathing, the small sounds of people who were conscious and unhurt and simply not able to do anything about it. 38 soldiers, each one secured with their own equipment, placed apart from each other carefully enough that none of them could reach another. None of them dead. "Luke," she said slowly. "Yeah." "How many came onto this station?" 46, he said. "The 4 at the command center are already contained. Team at the docking bay went down about 8 minutes in." He paused. "This corridor was the last group." She looked at him, at the graze on his arm, at his hands, at the complete and total absence of anything dramatic in his face. No triumph, no rage, no adrenaline burning through the surface. He looked like a man who had finished something that needed finishing. "You kept them all alive," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked down the corridor. "Because you're building something," he said simply. "Dead soldiers make that harder." Valeth stood in the doorway for a long moment. Outside, somewhere, the station was coming back online. She could hear systems restarting, lights warming up from blue to white, the low hum of the air processors returning to their normal rhythm. The station was waking up around them like nothing had happened, the way stations do, because the machines do not know what the people inside them have just been through. She looked at her husband standing in the corridor with borrowed weapons and a burned sleeve and 38 living soldiers behind him. She thought about the service record. 17 postings. Every one resolved. Situation resolved. Captain Carver present. She finally understood what that line meant. The inquiry began 12 days after the attack. Valeth had expected it. Formal inquiries were required under Vicari law whenever a member of the royal family was placed in direct physical danger. It was not optional, and it was not symbolic. The council would examine every detail, assign blame where blame was due, and make recommendations that carried the weight of legal order. Her father had sent 3 senior council members to Halveth to conduct it, along with a military review board of 5 officers and a court scribe who wrote everything down in the old formal script that Valeth had learned as a child and always found slightly exhausting to read. They held the sessions in the station's main meeting room, which was not large enough for the purpose and made everything feel slightly compressed. The council members sat on one side of the long table. Valeth and Luke sat on the other. The military board sat along the wall. The scribe sat in the corner and wrote constantly, without looking up, with the focused energy of someone who had decided that recording things accurately was the most important work a person could do and was going to prove it. The council questioned Valeth first. She answered everything directly and without decoration. She described the timeline, the breach, the response. She noted that communications had been cut before any alarm was raised, that the attack had been planned with detailed knowledge of the station layout, and that an internal investigation into the customs officer who cleared the false cargo ship was already underway. She was thorough and precise, and the council members nodded along with the expressions of people receiving information they already mostly had, but needed to hear stated formally for the record. Then they turned to Luke. The lead inquiry officer was a council member named Vorath, old, careful, with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had spent 40 years making sure words meant exactly what he wanted them to mean. He looked at Luke across the table the way you look at something you are trying to classify. "Captain Carver," he said, "at the time of the incursion you were not on duty." "No," Luke said. "You had no armor." "No. No support personnel, no backup, no advance warning through official channels." "That's right." Vorath looked down at the report in front of him. "And yet you were in the corridor before the attack team arrived." "Yes." "How?" Luke was quiet for a moment. "The docking scan was too clean," he said. "Mineral cargo from the outer belt always has trace particulate in the container seals. This shipment had none. Someone had wiped it. That's not something legitimate cargo does." Vorath looked at the military board members along the wall. Several of them were writing things down. "You identified a threat from a docking scan," Vorath said. "From a detail in a docking scan," Luke said. "Yes. And you acted on this without reporting it through the chain of command." "Communications were cut 4 minutes after I moved," Luke said. "If I had gone through the chain of command first, the timeline would not have worked." Vorath considered this. "You neutralized 46 trained Vicari soldiers." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." "You received 1 injury." "A graze. It healed." "And none of the attacking soldiers were killed." There was a pause in the room at this. Not a dramatic pause, just the natural pause that happens when a fact lands that is heavier than it first appears. The military board members looked at each other. One of them, a younger officer, leaned forward slightly without appearing to realize he was doing it. "None," Vorath said again, making it a question this time. "None," Luke confirmed. "Our analysts," Vorath said carefully, "have reviewed the incident report and the physical evidence in the corridor. They have concluded that keeping 46 attacking soldiers alive under those conditions was..." He paused, looking for the right word. Significantly more difficult than the alternative would have been. Yes, Luke said. Then why? Luke looked at Valeth for just a moment, then back at Vorath. Because dead soldiers have families, he said, and families remember. And then the people who sent those soldiers make martyrs out of them, and the story becomes about sacrifice instead of failure. 38 soldiers who go home walking have to live with what happened. That's more useful. The room was quiet. Vorath wrote something down. The scribe in the corner was writing faster than before. The inquiry lasted 2 more days. When it concluded, the council members returned to Vakar Prime with their findings, and Valeth and Luke went back to running the station, which had a backlog of trade disputes that had accumulated during the disruption and were not going to resolve themselves. But something had changed after the inquiry. Not between Valeth and Luke, or not only that. Something had changed in Valeth herself, in the way she was thinking. She started reading. She had always read. She was an educated woman, and she believed in knowing things. But she had read, until now, the kinds of things that were useful to her work: law, diplomatic history, territorial records, trade agreements. Now she started reading about humans. Not the summaries, not the diplomatic briefings she had grown up with, which described humanity in careful, neutral language, the way you describe something you are not entirely sure is safe to touch. She read their actual history, all of it, as much as she could find in the station's database and the additional files she requested from the Dominion Library Archive, who sent them without comment and probably with some curiosity about why the bonded princess was suddenly pulling 12 centuries of human historical records. What she found was not comfortable reading. She did not expect it to be. Humans had been fighting each other since before they left their first landmass. This was not unusual. Most species had violent histories. What was unusual was what happened after. Most species, when they lost badly enough, stopped. They reorganized, they adapted, they found new strategies, but the losing itself had weight. It slowed them down. It left a mark that took generations to fade. Humans lost and came back faster than the mark could set. She read about a war on old Earth where one side was completely destroyed. Their cities burned, their armies broken, their government dismantled, their economy reduced to almost nothing. And then she read about what happened 40 years later. The same people, rebuilt. Not just surviving, genuinely rebuilt, with new systems and new structures, and in some areas more advanced than they had been before the destruction. She read about a human soldier who had been captured and held for years, and came home and wrote a book about patience. She read about a human city that was bombed for 57 consecutive nights, and kept its lights off, and kept going. She kept returning to the same feeling. It was not admiration exactly, and it was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of looking at something that does not operate by the same rules you assumed everything operated by. Like discovering that a material you thought was rigid is actually flexible, and has been the whole time. And the flexibility is not a weakness, but the entire point. She thought about the corridor, about Luke standing in that hallway at 0300 with no armor and a calm face. Not because he was unafraid, but because being afraid was not going to change what needed to happen. She thought about the 42 days at Kepler Ridge. She thought about the pattern that kept repeating across 12 centuries of human history, the falling and the getting back up, and the specific quality of the getting back up, which was never frantic and never desperate, but always had that same characteristic that she had noticed in Luke from the very first negotiation session. Patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen. The patience of someone who has already decided what the outcome is going to be and is simply doing the work of getting there. She went to find him on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the inquiry. He was in the lower-level garden bay, a small pressurized space where the human staff had planted things from Earth with the particular stubbornness of people who intend to remind themselves where they come from. There were tomatoes growing in a long planter along the wall. a square of actual grass, absurdly green against the gray station floor, that several of the Vakari staff had started walking around carefully to avoid stepping on, without ever acknowledging that they were doing it, and a wooden bench that someone had brought in pieces and assembled with more effort than was strictly necessary for a bench. Luke was sitting on it with a book. His arm was healed. He looked up when she came in. "I have been reading about your people," she said, sitting down on the other end of the bench. "Anything interesting?" he asked. "Everything," she said, and meant it. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "In the corridor," she said, "before it started, when you were standing there waiting for them, were you afraid?" He thought about this seriously, which she appreciated. He did not give her the easy answer. "Yes," he said, "but you didn't show it." "Showing it would not have helped anything," he said. "Most people, when they are afraid, either freeze or run," she said. "You did neither." "There was a third option," he said. "Is that something you were trained to do? To choose the third option?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the small garden bay, the station hummed around them. Somewhere down the corridor, Soth was arguing cheerfully with one of the human logistics staff about the correct way to file a trade manifest. "Trained, yes," Luke said. "But training just gives you the tools. You still have to pick them up." Valeth looked at the tomato plants growing steadily along the wall. Red and ordinary and completely out of place on an asteroid station at the edge of Vakari space, growing anyway because someone had planted them and intended them to grow. "Luke," she said. "Yeah. I owe you an honesty." He closed his book. He gave her his full attention, which she had noticed he always did. When Luke listened, he actually listened. Not in the polite way people perform listening while waiting for their turn to speak, but in the real way. "When we met," she said, "I thought you were unremarkable." "I know," he said. "I thought they had sent me someone unimportant, someone they could spare." "That's usually the idea," he said. "I understand that now," she said. "I did not understand it then." She paused. "I think I have been wrong about many things." "Which things specifically?" he asked, not unkindly. She thought about the service record. 17 postings, the single line repeated in every file. She thought about the docking scan and the corridor and the 22 minutes and the 38 living soldiers. She thought about 12 centuries of human history getting knocked flat and standing back up. "I thought the treaty bond was a leash on me," she said, "that your government agreed to it because they had no choice." "And now?" he said. "Now," she said slowly, "I think your government agreed to it because they knew exactly what they were sending, and they wanted to give it a reason to stay pointed in one direction." Luke looked at her for a moment. "That's a very accurate read," he said quietly. "Are you going to tell me I'm wrong?" "No," he said. The garden was quiet around them. The grass was very green. The tomatoes were almost ripe. The Vorkai did not stop. That was the thing Valeth had hoped for and did not get. She had hoped that the failure at Halvith would be enough, that 46 soldiers going home without completing their mission would send a message back through the faction that the plan had a flaw, that the target was not as accessible as they had believed, that patience required more preparation. She had hoped the failure would buy time. Instead, it lit a fire. The Vorkai took the failure at Halvith and turned it into a speech. They stood in front of sympathetic officers across 7 Vakari military divisions and said, "Look what the humans did. Look what one human did to 46 of our soldiers on our own station. Look at what the Dominion has allowed through this treaty. Look at what we have become." And the officers who had been sitting quietly with their doubts for over a year listened to that speech and made a decision. 3 months after Halvith, the Vorkai declared open insurrection. 3 fleets, 40,000 soldiers. They broadcast their declaration across every major communication channel in Vakari space, which meant every neutral species in the region heard it at the same time as the Dominion, which meant the political situation became extremely complicated, extremely fast. The Vorkai named Valeth a traitor to her bloodline. They declared the treaty void. They said humanity was an infestation that had been allowed to take root in Vakari space, and they intended to remove it. Valith was on Vakar Prime when the broadcast went out. She was sitting in her father's council chamber, which was where she had been for most of the past 3 months, doing the slow and difficult work of holding the Dominion's political structure together while the Vorkai built their movement in the shadows. She heard the broadcast and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not quite. The particular heaviness of something you have been preparing for arriving anyway. Her father, Dominion Lord Herath, looked older than she had ever seen him look. He sat at the head of the council table with his hands flat on the stone surface and his crest low, which in Vakari body language meant something between grief and resolve. And he looked at his council and said, "What does the human government say?" The answer came 6 hours later. The human government was sending 1 ship, not a fleet. The council members looked at each other when this information arrived. One of them said carefully that perhaps there had been a translation error. There had not been a translation error. 1 ship. A long-range operations vessel called the Cassius Gray, crew of 14, currently en route to Vakari space and expected to arrive in 31 hours. 14 people, one council member said, against 40,000. Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer that would have sounded reasonable. Valith looked at her father. Her father looked at the table. "Who is on the ship?" Herath said. The communications officer checked the manifest, looked up. "It lists a 12-person specialist unit," he said, "and a mission commander." He paused. "Captain Luke Carver." The council chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Herath said, "Good," in the tone of a man who has just received the only piece of information in the last 6 hours that he actually wanted. Valith went to work. She did not have time to think about what Luke was doing or where the Cassius Gray was in relation to the Vorkai fleets. She had her own battlefield, and it was this council chamber and the 14 other political bodies that were watching the Vakari Dominion fracture from a safe distance and deciding what it meant for them. 3 neutral species had already sent quiet messages asking which side they should acknowledge as the legitimate Dominion government. 2 trading coalitions had suspended shipments pending resolution. 1 small civilization on the outer edge of the conflict zone had started moving its population ships toward the border, which was the political equivalent of an exit sign lighting up. She handled all of it. She sent messages and received them. She held video conferences with faction representatives at 2 in the morning. She sat across from her father's most resistant council members and found the arguments that moved them. She tracked the movement of neutral species fleets and wrote the diplomatic language that kept them from doing anything irreversible before the situation clarified. She was very good at this. She knew she was good at it. And she knew that what she was doing mattered, that the political structure she was holding together was the thing Luke would have something to come back to when it was finished. She kept that thought close. It helped. The reports started coming in on day 3. A Vorkai command post on the moon of Thevris, considered impenetrable. The Vorkai had been building it for 8 months, reinforced walls, multiple security layers, a garrison of 300. It went silent at 0200 with no warning and no explanation. Dominion-loyal troops arrived 6 hours later to find every door still locked from the outside and every person inside the facility secured in the detention level. The commanding general was in her own cell. She was physically unharmed. She would not describe in detail what had happened. When pressed, she said only that she had been asleep and had woken up already in the cell, and that she recommended in a very quiet voice that the insurrection be reconsidered. On day 7, a Vorkai supply convoy of 11 ships with 2 escort frigates disappeared from tracking for 4 hours while traveling through the Halvith corridor. When they reappeared, they were still on course, still moving at the same speed, still intact. But there was no crew aboard any of the 13 vessels. Every ship was on autopilot. The cargo was completely untouched. The crew of 140 people was later found on a nearby station, unharmed, locked in a cargo bay, with no clear memory of how they had gotten there, and a collective reluctance to talk about the last thing they did remember. Nobody ever found out how. On day 11, the Vorkai Second Fleet engaged a Dominion patrol group in open space, and was winning the engagement by a significant margin. Then all fleet communications went down simultaneously. Not jammed. The Vorkai technical teams checked immediately and found no jamming signal, no interference pattern, no external cause. The system simply stopped working for 4 hours. When it came back up, the tactical advantage had shifted. The Dominion patrol had been reinforced, and 3 of the Vorkai fleet captains had independently decided that continuing the engagement was no longer advisable. The fleet pulled back. The following morning, the fleet admiral sent a private message to the Vorkai High Command that said only, "Something is wrong. Reconsider." The High Command did not reconsider. On day 19, Luke walked into their command chamber. The Vorkai High Command was gathered on a deep space station called the Iron Keep, a fortress built into an asteroid, sealed, with no docking access that had not been physically welded shut 3 days earlier as a security measure. The command team had received enough reports by now that they had decided the safest place was somewhere nobody could reach. They were in the middle of a strategy meeting when the door opened. Not forced, not broken. It simply opened from the inside, as if it had always been accessible and they had simply not been paying attention. Luke walked in. He was wearing a plain jacket over his tactical gear, and he looked exactly the same as he always looked. Calm, unhurried, like a man who has finished a long shift and knows what comes next. His hands were empty. He walked to the table, set down a folder of documents in front of the admiral, and straightened up. "Those are the terms," he said. "They are fair. Take your time and read them." The admiral, a decorated general named Vorik, 40 years of service, 3 wars, a wall of commendations in his office back on Vakar Prime, looked at the documents. Looked at the sealed door behind Luke, which was still sealed, still welded, with no visible sign of how it had been opened. Looked at the man standing across the table. "How did you get in here?" Vorik said. "The terms," Luke said, not unkindly, just patiently, the way you redirect a conversation that is going somewhere unproductive. Vorik looked at the documents. He looked at his command team along the table. 8 people, all senior officers, all armed, and every single one of them had the same expression, which was the expression of people reassessing a situation very quickly and arriving at conclusions they did not enjoy. Vorik picked up the documents and read them. They were fair. That was the thing that almost undid him. The terms were genuinely fair. No punishment beyond disarmament and a period of supervision. No executions. No public humiliation of the officers involved. The treaty terms remained unchanged. There was even a clause that addressed the original grievances the Vorkai had raised, not by validating the insurrection, but by creating a formal council process through which military concerns about the treaty could be raised and debated. Someone on the human side had written these terms very carefully. Vorik signed. His command team signed after him. The insurrection ended on day 19 with no confirmed fatalities on either side. Military analysts across 6 species reviewed the campaign afterward and could not agree on a framework that explained it. The numbers did not work. The timeline did not work. The methods were largely undocumented. A xenosociologist at the Vakari Academic Institute wrote a paper suggesting that the campaign represented a new category of conflict resolution that did not have a name yet, and her paper was widely read and generated a great deal of discussion and ultimately produced no satisfying conclusion, which she noted in a follow-up paper was itself probably informative. Valeth was standing at the docking bay of Vakar Prime when the Cassius Gray came in. She had been there for 20 minutes before it arrived, which she would not have admitted to anyone. She stood with her hands folded and her crest level and watched the ship settle into the bay with the quiet efficiency of a vessel whose crew did things correctly and without ceremony. The ramp came down. Luke walked out first. He looked tired in a way that only appeared if you knew what his normal looked like. a slight heaviness around the eyes, a set to the shoulders that was maybe 3% more deliberate than usual. His jacket needed replacing. He was carrying nothing. He walked down the ramp and crossed the docking bay floor and stopped in front of her. Behind him, his unit came down the ramp in ones and twos and dispersed into the station without speaking to anyone, the way smoke disperses in a room, present, then gone. 19 days, Valeth said. The communication network took longer than I expected, he said. I'm sorry. Luke. Yeah. She looked at him. She had spent 19 days holding a political structure together and thinking, in the spaces between meetings and messages, about everything she had read and everything she had seen, and the specific thing she had told him on the bench in the Garden Bay, that the treaty bond was not a leash on her, but a leash on him, something to keep him pointed in one direction. She had thought about whether that was a fair thing, whether it was right to use a person that way, even with their knowledge, even with their agreement. And then she had thought about the terms in that folder, the careful, fair, generous terms that someone had written for a faction that had tried to kill her. The clause about the formal council process, the absence of punishment beyond what was necessary. She had thought about 38 soldiers going home walking, about 140 crew members unharmed in a cargo bay, about a commanding general in her own cell, physically unharmed, quietly recommending that the insurrection be reconsidered. 19 days, 40,000 soldiers, no one dead. I read the terms you brought them, she said. Okay, he said. You wrote the clause about the council process. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. That was my work, she said. That was the political side. You did not have to do that. You were busy, he said simply. I had time on the ship. Valeth looked at this man, quiet, still, unremarkable to anyone who had not been paying attention, which was exactly how he preferred it, and felt something that she had been slowly building toward for over a year arrive fully and settle into place. She reached out and took his hand, not the formal binding hold of the ceremony, not a gesture for anyone watching, just her hand around his, the way people hold on to things that are real. I was wrong about you from the beginning, she said. Most people are, he said. I know, she said. I think you prefer it that way. The ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Noted, he said. Outside the docking bay windows, Vakar Prime turned slowly in its orbit, the same way it had turned through 300 years of war and 1 year of careful peace. And the stars beyond it were very still, and the galaxy was, for now, quiet. The peace was real. And in a building on Earth with no sign on its door, in a filing cabinet in a room that very few people had clearance to enter, a folder was updated with a single new line in plain, unhurried handwriting. Treaty secured, coming home. And then came Kepler Ridge, a mountain pass on a cold planet at the edge of contested space. A human battalion, 412 soldiers, mostly young, mostly tired, with supply lines that had been cut for 11 days. The Vakari sent 60,000 troops to remove them. Simple math, the kind of problem that solves itself. It did not solve itself. The human battalion held that pass for 42 days, not because they had better weapons, not because they had air support or reinforcements or any particular strategic advantage. They held it because they simply refused to stop. Every time the Vakari pushed, the humans bent and then came back. Every time a position was overrun, a new one appeared. The Vakari generals sent more troops, then more after that. They burned the hillsides and froze the water supply and cut communications 3 separate times. And on the 42nd day, when Vakari Command finally sent word that they were preparing to use a ground-leveling weapon that would simply remove the mountain entirely, they received back a piece of intelligence that their analysts initially refused to believe. The human battalion was walking out, not retreating, walking, in formation, carrying their wounded and their equipment. 412 went in, 409 came out. The three who did not come out had died on day 2, before the holding action had even properly begun. The Vakari High Council met in closed session for 6 days after that. On the 7th day, for the first time in recorded history, they sent a message to the human government. They wanted to talk. The talks took 4 months and produced a single document, a peace treaty, 48 pages, covering territorial boundaries, trade rights, prisoner exchange, and one final clause that the humans almost rejected and eventually accepted because the Vakari made clear, very politely, that there would be no treaty without it. The final clause required a bonding, a marriage between the Vakari ruling family and a representative of the human negotiating body. This was not ceremonial in Vakari culture. It was law, old and absolute. 2 people bound together meant 2 peoples bound together. If the treaty broke, the bonded pair shared the consequences of their respective governments. It was meant to make both sides careful. It was meant to make the peace feel real in a way that paper alone never did. The humans deliberated for 3 weeks. Then they sent Captain Luke Carver. He arrived on Vakar Prime on a transport ship with no escort, carrying 1 bag, wearing a plain gray uniform without decoration. The Vakari officials who met him at the docking bay had expected someone taller, someone with medals at least, someone who looked like what they were sending, a representative of a species that had just held a mountain pass for 42 days against 60,000 soldiers. Luke Carver was average height, with dark hair that was going a little gray at the sides even though he was only 34. He had calm brown eyes and the kind of face that didn't give much away. He shook hands with the officials at the dock, thanked them for meeting him, picked up his own bag without waiting for anyone to take it, and asked if he could have a glass of water before the first meeting. That was the man they sent. The Vakari princess assigned to the bonding arrangement was named Valith. She was the 6th daughter of Dominion Lord Herath, which meant she had been raised with all the responsibility of the royal line and none of the expectation of ever inheriting it, which had suited her perfectly, because what she had wanted, since she was very small, was to study law and diplomacy rather than stand in a succession line. She was sharp and methodical, and did not have much patience for things that wasted her time. She looked at Luke Carver across the long stone table of the first negotiation session and thought he looked like someone who delivered packages. "You are the one they sent," she said in Galactic Standard, not softening it. "I am," he said. "You have no titles." "No." "No military rank displayed." "Not today." "No." She studied him the way she studied everything, methodically, looking for the thing that explained it, because something had to explain it. Her government did not send unremarkable men to do remarkable things. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps that was exactly what they did. She filed the thought away. "You understand what this arrangement means," she said. "What you are agreeing to." "Yes," Luke said, "and you agreed anyway." "Someone had to," he said simply, and reached for the water they had brought him. The talks concluded in 2 days. The ceremony was scheduled for the 3rd. On the morning of the wedding, Valith stood in the preparation chamber while her attendants arranged her formal crest covering, and her youngest sister, Lavith, sat on a bench nearby asking questions that Valith did not particularly want to answer. "Have you spoken with him much?" Lavith asked. "Enough," Valith said. "What is he like?" Valith thought about the negotiation table, about the way Luke had sat through 8 hours of dense legal language without fidgeting once, about the way he had listened to every point the Vakari Council made before responding, and how his responses were always short and always precise, and how he never argued a point he couldn't support. About the way he had noticed, on the 2nd day, that one of the junior Vakari clerks was struggling to translate a particular passage, and had quietly reworded his own proposal to make it easier without being asked. "Careful," she said finally. Lavith blinked. "Is that good or bad?" Valith did not answer because she genuinely did not know yet. The ceremony was held under Vakari's sacred fire in the great outer hall, with 10,000 soldiers standing in formal rows, and the High Council seated in a crescent above the floor, and Dominion Lord Herath at the center, with the expression of a man doing something he had decided was necessary and intended to do with dignity. The sacred fire burned in shades of gold and deep red. The smoke smelled like minerals and old wood. Luke stood through all of it without moving. Not stiff, just still. When the ceremonial binding cord was wrapped around both their wrists, looping 3 times in the old Vakari tradition, he looked down at it for a moment, and then looked up at Valeth. She had expected something on his face, relief or awkwardness, or the particular forced pleasantness of a man in an uncomfortable situation trying to appear fine. But what she saw was none of those things. What she saw looked like someone who had just accepted a weight and knew exactly how heavy it was, and had already decided they were going to carry it. That night they sat across from each other in the residence assigned to them, a stone room with high ceilings and a window that looked out over the capital city, and Valeth set her hands flat on the table and said what she had decided she was going to say. "I will not pretend this is something it is not." "Neither will I," Luke said. "Then what do you intend to do with it?" He thought about this for a moment, and she noticed that he did that, actually thought before he spoke, instead of just filling the air with words. "My job," he said. "Same as you." "And what do you believe your job is?" He slid one of the 2 water cups across the table toward her. "Making sure that when this is over," he said, "you're still standing." Valeth looked at the cup, then at him. "You say that as if you expect trouble." "I always expect trouble," Luke said. "It's easier that way." She picked up the cup. Outside the window, the sacred fire was still burning in the square below, casting long gold light across the stone streets of the Vakari capital, and the soldiers who had stood in rows all day were beginning to disperse into the night. And somewhere above them, the stars that 300 years of war had been fought over hung completely still and quiet. The peace had begun. Neither of them slept much that first night, not out of tension or closeness or any dramatic reason, simply because they were both, in their own ways, the kind of people who found it difficult to stop watching when they were in a new place. Valeth noticed, sometime around the 3rd hour of the night, that Luke had positioned his chair so that it faced the door. She noticed it. She filed it away. She did not mention it. Not yet.